The night was not silent. It breathed, the kind of breath that does not belong to wind or trees, but something older, heavier, pressing against the skin in ways that made a person shift uneasily, without knowing why. Imagine standing at your window, the blinds drawn halfway, and beyond the dim reflection of your own face in the glass you sense it, that feeling of being watched. Not by strangers far away, not by creatures whispered of in legends, but by someone who lives just feet from your door. Someone who knows when you turn off your lights, when you take your trash outside, when you leave your windows cracked open to let the night air in. That is where this story begins. A neighborhood like any other. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, familiar faces nodding politely during the day. A place that pretended to be safe, but safety is a fragile illusion, and behind it lies something far colder. What makes this story disturbing is not its violence, not even its conclusion, but the slow unraveling of trust. Trust between people who lived side by side, who waved in the mornings, who shared the same sidewalks and the same unspoken promise that neighbors look out for each other. It is easy to imagine evil in the distant dark, across forests or deserts or abandoned buildings. But what if it lives directly next door? What if it smiles at you every morning as though nothing is wrong? One account described it best. It was not the noise that frightened me. It was the silence that followed it. A quote repeated by those who lived nearby, each remembering nights where they lay awake in their beds, staring at the ceiling, listening. The noises were always small, never loud enough to justify calling the police. Footsteps across gravel when no one should have been outside, a faint scratching at windows long after midnight, the hollow sound of a door slowly closing though every family insisted theirs remained locked. At first, people convinced themselves it was nothing. A raccoon, a gust of wind rattling loose siding, their imaginations playing tricks after too many sleepless nights. Yet fear has a way of feeding itself, and the smallest detail once ignored can become a splinter under the skin. You cannot see it, but you cannot stop feeling it. This neighborhood learned that in the cruelest way. It started with the children. They were the first to whisper about the strange man who lingered at the corner, the woman who stood by her curtains long after everyone else went to bed. Parents dismissed these stories as childish fantasies, fueled by bedtime tales or shadows in streetlights. But children notice things adults refuse to. Their fears are not always without reason. One summer evening, just as the last light drained from the sky, a group of neighbors gathered outside after dinner. They spoke casually, the way people do when there is still warmth in the air and nothing urgent pressing on their minds. But even then, something about the night felt wrong. The street was too quiet, the houses too still. No one laughed loudly, no one raised their voice. Every conversation hovered on the edge of whisper, as if they feared someone might be listening. And perhaps someone was. It is important to understand that this was not a neighborhood of strangers. These were families who had lived side by side for years. They borrowed sugar from one another. They traded lawn equipment. They babysat each other's children. And yet there was one house that everyone avoided. One house that remained unlit even on festive nights. Its curtains always drawn, its yard just a little too overgrown. At first, people excused it. Some folks value privacy, some keep to themselves. But the longer you live near silence, the louder it begins to feel. Reports would later describe the sensation of walking past that house as walking through a shadow. Not just darker than the rest, but heavier, as though the air around it thickened. Dogs refused to linger near its fence. Children hurried past without explanation. Adults laughed it off, but their eyes avoided its windows as if acknowledging it too directly might invite something in. The story that haunts this place does not begin with a scream or a police siren. It begins with a neighbor's casual glance, a simple movement of curtains at the wrong time of night. It begins with small disappearances, mail missing from boxes, garden tools no one remembered misplacing, lights flickering out in one home after another. These details sound trivial in isolation, but together, they sketch a portrait of something invasive, something watching, something that wanted to be noticed but never caught, and so, the question lingers. What do you do when the danger is not distant, not abstract, but living on the other side of your wall? What do you do when you realize that the eyes peering through your window at night are not strangers but neighbors? The truth is far more unsettling than fiction because it leaves us with no defense. Locks and alarms protect us from the outside, but they cannot protect us from those who already belong. The cold fact is this: every year, reports surface of crimes committed not by strangers, but by people known, trusted, welcomed into communities. Neighbors who smiled, waved, and lived among others unnoticed until it was too late. This story is one of them. A story that has no neat resolution, no comforting distance. The silence of the house next door is not always empty. Sometimes it is listening, sometimes it is waiting, and sometimes it is already inside. The neighborhood seemed ordinary, almost painfully so. A cluster of homes pressed close together, separated only by narrow driveways and thin fences. The streets curled in a quiet loop, ending where the woods began, as if the entire development had been built in defiance of the dark trees that loomed just beyond the asphalt. By day, the place looked calm, even inviting. Neatly trimmed grass stretched across small yards. Children's bicycles leaned lazily against porches, and the faint sound of dogs barking carried through the afternoon air. It was the kind of place where life appeared predictable, even safe. But that safety was an illusion, one born of repetition, one that only lasted as long as people chose not to look too closely. For years, the neighborhood had been described as peaceful. Real estate brochures boasted about the quiet, about the sense of community, about the way families stayed for decades rather than moving on. On the surface, this was true. Many of the residents had known one another for years, sometimes for generations. They exchanged holiday cards, shared weekend barbecues, and waved from their porches on late summer evenings. This familiarity created a kind of trust, a trust so deep it blinded them to the shadows that moved quietly between their homes. Every neighborhood carries its own history, small details buried under layers of routine. This one was no different. Decades earlier, before the streets were paved and the houses built, the land had been a forested stretch where few people lingered after dark. Locals whispered about strange lights and echoes that did not belong, about figures glimpsed between the trees. These stories never made it into official records. They survived only in memory, passed down through families who had once lived nearby. When construction crews arrived, clearing the trees and laying foundations, those old whispers faded, dismissed as folklore. Yet not all things disappear when ignored. Some remain, waiting. The house at the center of this story was one of the oldest in the neighborhood. Built before the others, its design was slightly different, less polished, less uniform. Its paint seemed to fade faster. Its windows seemed darker even in daylight. Unlike its newer neighbors, the house never seemed to belong. People noticed but said nothing. After all, a house is just wood and stone. Or so they told themselves. Families had come and gone from that house, rarely staying long. Each departure was explained with practical excuses: new jobs, better schools, financial struggles. No one openly admitted unease, yet each family left quickly, almost abruptly, as if they had grown tired of pretending. In hushed tones, some neighbors acknowledged the pattern, but it became a rule of silence. People did not want to think too hard about why no one stayed. They told themselves the reasons were ordinary. They told themselves it was nothing. The family who lived next door was different. They had been in the neighborhood for years, comfortable, rooted. They knew everyone, hosted gatherings, walked their dog along the same path every evening. They believed they understood their community, that the bonds of shared history protected them. It is easy to believe in safety when it has never been broken, but small things began to unsettle them. At first, it was only a feeling. Standing on the porch at dusk, the father thought he saw someone watching from the neighboring yard, but when he turned, the windows were empty. The mother, folding laundry upstairs, swore she heard a door closing outside, though every house looked still. Their daughter claimed that someone tapped at her window at night, though her room was on the second floor. These details were brushed away, each explained by reason. Shadows, the wind, children's imaginations. Still, unease grew. The house next door rarely showed signs of life. Curtains stayed closed. Lights flickered at odd hours. Cars came and went without notice. Yet sometimes late at night, the family heard faint movements, footsteps across gravel, a door opening and closing softly, a voice too low to be understood. When they mentioned it to other neighbors, the response was always the same: a shrug, a dismissive smile, an uncomfortable silence. No one wanted to acknowledge the tension. Admitting it meant admitting something was wrong, and people preferred their illusions. And so the family endured the small disturbances, convincing themselves they were exaggerating, but their bodies betrayed them. They found themselves waking at night, straining their ears against the silence. Their hearts quickened when walking past the darkened house. Even their dog, once playful, began growling softly at the fence, tail tucked, refusing to approach. The history of the neighborhood became more relevant the longer they lived with this unease. Old residents whispered, half joking, about things that had happened decades earlier. Break-ins, disappearances, unexplained accidents. Nothing proven, nothing official. But stories have a way of staining memory, and the stain grew darker the more they listened. It became impossible to ignore the sense that something in the neighborhood was watching, waiting, feeding on the comfort of those who refused to see it. The family tried to resist the thought. They clung to the idea that community meant safety, that neighbors looked out for one another, that evil belonged somewhere else. But evil does not always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you have seen every day for years. What unsettled them most was not the possibility of violence, but the certainty of intrusion. They did not feel threatened from the outside. They felt invaded from within. Their privacy, their boundaries, their sense of security, all of it seemed thinner than they had ever realized. And once that awareness takes root, it never leaves. By the time they admitted the truth to themselves, it was already too late. The history of the neighborhood, the whispers of the land, the silence of the house next door, it all converged into one realization. Safety had never been real. The danger was not arriving. It had always been there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally notice. The change began slowly, almost invisibly, the way rot begins beneath the surface of wood long before the structure gives way. At first, the family noticed only the smallest things, the kinds of details no one else would bother remembering. A garbage bin turned at the wrong angle, a set of footprints pressed into damp soil even though the rain had stopped hours before, the faint sound of a whistle drifting through the night cut off too abruptly, as if someone realized they were being overheard. They told themselves these were coincidences. But coincidences do not multiply. By late autumn, the atmosphere around the neighborhood had shifted. The family began marking the nights when something seemed wrong, and soon nearly every evening carried its own disturbance. Sometimes it was nothing more than a door creaking open in the distance, carried strangely clear through the still air. Other times it was more deliberate, objects misplaced on their porch, small piles of stones arranged in patterns no one admitted leaving, a faint tapping sound at their window panes as if fingers pressed lightly against the glass. The tension spread inside the home. Sleep became difficult. Conversations grew shorter, clipped, restless. Each person in the family carried their own suspicion but struggled to speak it aloud, because naming fear often makes it heavier. And yet silence did not protect them. It only deepened the sense that something unseen had already claimed a place between them. One night, as the father stepped outside to lock the car, he saw a shadow move across the yard. The movement was too quick, too precise to be the wind or an animal. He froze, holding his breath, his hand tightening on the key ring. For a moment there was nothing. Only the dim outline of the neighboring house, its windows shut tight. But then he noticed the curtain move just slightly, as if someone had been standing there watching him. The curtain settled back into stillness, leaving him uncertain if he had truly seen it. He walked back inside without saying a word. Soon after, the daughter began waking in the middle of the night, insisting she heard someone whispering outside her window. Her voice trembled each time she described it. Not loud enough to understand, but close enough that she could feel the presence of a mouth speaking only inches away. At first, her parents tried to reassure her, but reassurance is fragile when you yourself are uncertain. The father began sitting awake at night, waiting, listening. But when silence stretched too long, he would drift into uneasy sleep, never catching the moment when the whispering returned. Neighbors noticed their unease. Some admitted they too had heard strange noises or seen unusual movements in the shadows between houses, but their confessions ended quickly, drowned beneath nervous laughter and the insistence that it must be nothing. People did not want to feed fear. They wanted to bury it. And so, each household suffered its own quiet dread and isolation, never acknowledging aloud what they suspected, that something unnatural had taken root among them. The incidents escalated. One evening, the mother discovered their garden gate wide open, though she had locked it earlier herself. She closed it, secured it tightly, and checked again before bed. But at dawn the next morning, the gate stood open once more, swinging lightly in the breeze. Another night, The family returned from visiting friends to find their porch light unscrewed, the bulb resting cold and loose on the ground. It was not broken, not stolen, just removed as if someone had wanted the house to sit in deeper darkness. They tried reporting their unease to authorities, but without proof the complaints went nowhere. No one could point to a crime. Nothing had been stolen, no one had been harmed. What they described sounded like paranoia, the kind of nervousness that builds when stress runs high, and yet each night reminded them that this was not imagination. The scratches on the windows, the echo of steps pacing across their driveway, the sound of someone, lingering just out of sight. The worst moment came on a cold evening when the daughter swore she saw someone standing at the edge of their yard. She described the figure as tall, unmoving, barely visible in the gloom. She had blinked, and in that blink it was gone. The father rushed outside, searching with a flashlight, but the yard was empty. Only the grass bent where someone had stood. Only footprints pressed into the earth remained, leading nowhere, vanishing before the end of the fence line. After that night, the family no longer pretended. They spoke their fears aloud, admitted to one another what they had each seen, each felt. They realized the strangeness was not isolated, not imagined. It was deliberate. Someone was watching them. Someone was entering their world in ways they could not stop. But perhaps the most disturbing part was not the intrusions themselves. It was the uncertainty of their source. The family began studying the habits of their neighbors more closely. Who came home late? Who lingered too long outside? Whose lights flickered on at unusual hours? Every smile they received during the day now carried the weight of suspicion. Every passing glance felt longer than it should. The safety of community had fractured. Trust had withered. The build-up was slow, but it was effective. By the time winter arrived, the family lived in a constant state of vigilance. They double-checked every lock, pulled curtains tight, kept lights burning through the night. But the disturbances did not stop. They grew bolder. Shadows seemed to move closer. Sounds seemed sharper. And always behind the glass of the darkened house next door, curtains swayed just enough to suggest that someone was there, waiting, recording their fear. The neighborhood no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a stage, and someone unseen was directing the play. The family was no longer living in their home. They were surviving it, each day bleeding into the next, each night stretching longer, colder, more unbearable. The build-up of the mystery was not dramatic or sudden. It was methodical, patient, like a hand slowly tightening around their throats, and as they would soon learn, the worst had not yet happened. The family's unease had grown into something heavier than fear. It had become a constant, pressing weight, the kind that lingered even in daylight. Their lives had turned into a search for answers, but answers refused to come clearly. What they found instead were fragments, half-truths, and contradictions that only deepened the mystery. The first clue came not from inside their own home, but from the whispers of neighbors. Quietly, almost in confidence, one neighbor admitted she too had noticed the strange disturbances. She described hearing someone walk past her porch at night, though when she looked out, the street lay empty. Another mentioned that her dog had begun growling at shadows near the fence, refusing to go outside after dusk. These details were small, but they revealed something significant. The family was not alone in their experience. Something was happening across the neighborhood, even if no one wanted to admit it openly. The father began keeping a notebook, recording every detail, every disturbance. He noted the times when lights flickered, when footsteps were heard, when objects were found out of place. Patterns began to form, though none provided comfort. The disturbances rarely occurred during storms or on particularly loud nights. Instead, they came in stretches of silence, as if whoever was responsible preferred to work when the neighborhood lay still, when even the smallest noise could be heard. The most unsettling entries in his notebook were not the events themselves, but the absence of explanation. Footprints appeared in the garden that led nowhere, ending abruptly as though the figure who left them had vanished into thin air. Tools were found moved from one shed to another, without anyone remembering taking them. The mother once discovered a handprint smudged faintly on the inside of their back window, though she had cleaned it the day before. No one could explain how it had returned. Seeking clarity, they reached out to local authorities once more, this time armed with the notebook. Officers listened, glanced at the entries, and offered polite but weary reassurances. Without hard evidence, there was little they could do. What was a loose light bulb? What was an open gate? None of it proved intent. None of it proved danger. The official response, though professional, left the family more unsettled. If the authorities did not believe them, then who would? Still, they searched for meaning. The mother began collecting testimonies from neighbors, not as formal interviews but through careful conversation. She asked simple questions during walks or while exchanging greetings, and sometimes people opened up. A man down the street mentioned hearing humming near his bedroom window, but when he checked, no one was there. A woman spoke of receiving mail that looked tampered with, envelopes resealed awkwardly, though nothing seemed missing. These details were chilling in their ordinariness. Small, invasive acts. Not enough to call crimes, but enough to gnaw at the edges of trust. One neighbor offered a darker theory. He suggested the house at the edge of the street had always been strange, even before the newest family moved in. He claimed that years earlier, a child had vanished from the area without explanation, and though no connection was ever proven, whispers had always returned to that house. He admitted he had no proof, only rumor. But rumor has power when fear is already present. The father's notebook grew thicker with every passing week. But as the pages filled, so did the contradictions. If someone was truly entering their property, how did they avoid being seen so often? How did they vanish so quickly, leaving only faint marks behind? If it was merely paranoia, then how did multiple neighbors share similar stories at similar times? The evidence seemed to point in every direction at once, refusing to settle into one truth. Psychological theories crept into their conversations. The mother wondered if their growing unease had created a kind of collective paranoia, a fear that fed on itself until it spilled across the neighborhood. The father disagreed. He pointed to the physical evidence, the footprints, the smudged handprint, the objects deliberately rearranged. Those were not hallucinations. They were real, but real did not always mean explainable. The daughter, caught in the middle, began to internalize the tension in a different way. She drew pictures of their home with dark shapes around it, figures without faces pressed against the windows. When asked why she drew them, she answered simply, "Because they are there." Her words unsettled the parents more than anything else. A child's honesty can sometimes reveal what adults refuse to accept. One night, in an attempt to gather real proof, the father set up a camera facing the backyard. He let it run through the night, hoping to capture something. The next morning, when he checked the footage, his stomach turned. At 3:17 a.m., the image showed a faint movement near the fence. A figure, blurred, indistinct, stood for several seconds, motionless, staring toward the house. Then the footage glitched, a sharp static blur that lasted only a second. When the image cleared, the figure was gone. He showed the video to his wife, his hands shaking. She stared at it, silent, her face pale. Neither spoke of it again, but both knew what they had seen. The evidence was there, undeniable, yet it brought no answers. Only more questions. The contradictions became unbearable. How could a presence be so deliberate yet leave no proof that authorities would accept? How could something feel so undeniably real yet remain shrouded in ambiguity? The deeper they looked, the less they understood. The family's search for clarity did not resolve the mystery. It sharpened it, cut into their lives like glass. Every clue, every testimony, every fragment of evidence led them deeper into uncertainty. It was not the absence of answers that terrified them most. It was the possibility that the answers existed but lay just beyond their reach, hidden deliberately by someone who wanted them to remain afraid. The investigation was not solving the mystery, it was feeding it. The human mind is not built to live in constant tension. It can endure sudden shocks, it can adapt to crises, but a steady, unrelenting sense of being watched corrodes something deeper. The family began to unravel quietly, not with loud arguments or dramatic scenes, but in the subtle ways people fracture when their reality no longer feels secure. The father changed first. Once steady, practical, the kind of man who fixed problems, With his hands, he became restless, consumed by vigilance. He paced the house at night, checking locks again and again, his footsteps echoing against the quiet walls. His notebook lay open on the kitchen table, pages filled with scrawled observations that grew darker, more frantic. He stopped sleeping through the night, his eyes hollow, his temper short. Every sound became a trigger. A branch snapping outside sent him rushing to the window. A car door slamming down the street had him clutching the nearest object like a weapon. His family watched him transform from protector into prisoner of his own fear. The mother suffered in silence. She tried to hold the family together, to soothe her daughter's nightmares, to calm her husband's paranoia, but the strain left her hollow. She stopped hosting neighbors for coffee, stopped attending gatherings. Her smiles became thin, forced, her laughter brittle. At night, when the house settled into uneasy silence, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every noise, every shadow, every flicker of doubt. Fear eroded her sense of home. What once was a place of comfort now felt like a trap. Every window a vulnerability, every wall too thin to protect her. The daughter carried the burden in ways no child should. She withdrew from friends, her drawings filled with faceless figures, her voice trembling when she spoke of the whispers outside her window. At school, she struggled to focus, her teachers noting the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her eyes darted to the door as though expecting someone to walk in. Children are often resilient, but resilience has limits. She began wetting the bed at night, crying silently so her parents would not hear. The weight of fear pressed on her small shoulders, teaching her a lesson she should never have learned, that the world closest to you can be the most dangerous. But the impact extended beyond the family. The neighborhood itself grew tense, strained by suspicion. Conversations once easy became clipped, guarded. People looked at one another differently, their smiles hiding unease. Trust eroded. Every neighbor wondered if another held the answers, if another was responsible. The community that once boasted of safety now carried an undercurrent of dread, a quiet acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong. Fear is contagious. It spreads through glances, through whispers, through silence. The family's distress infected the neighborhood, making others notice what they once ignored. Lights burned longer into the night. Curtains stayed closed. Fewer children played outside. A community once open and familiar became a collection of locked doors and suspicious eyes. Psychologists would later say that this was inevitable, that living under constant threat, even unproven, shatters the psyche. They would explain how fear rewires the brain, sharpening instincts, dulling trust, creating paranoia where once there was connection. But explanations do not ease the suffering of those trapped inside it. The family did not care about theories. They cared about survival. The father began drinking more heavily, using alcohol to dull the edge of fear, but it left him more irritable, more volatile. The mother stopped answering the phone, stopped responding to messages, retreating further into herself. The daughter begged not to sleep in her own room, clinging to her parents until exhaustion overtook her. The house itself became suffocating, filled not with safety but with the residue of fear. Even when nothing happened, they could not escape it. Days with no disturbances were the worst of all because silence meant waiting, bracing for the next intrusion. Anxiety lived in their bones. The sound of the refrigerator hum made them jolt. The ticking of the clock in the hall grew unbearable, a reminder that time dragged forward, each second heavy with anticipation. And then there was the paranoia. It twisted their thoughts until even the ordinary became suspect. The father began to wonder if their neighbors were deliberately watching them, waiting for weakness. The mother questioned if she had seen movement in the corner of her eye, though she knew the room was empty. The daughter insisted she heard footsteps upstairs when all three of them were in the kitchen together. No proof, no clarity, just layers of doubt thickening like fog. This emotional erosion did not explode in sudden breakdowns. It showed itself in quiet, devastating ways. The father stopped laughing. The mother stopped cooking meals she once loved. The daughter stopped singing to herself at play. Their lives became shadows of what they had been. stripped of joy, stripped of trust, reduced to survival. Neighbors noticed. They saw the drawn faces, the closed curtains, the fatigue in their voices. Some offered sympathy, others pulled away, afraid of being pulled into the same darkness. Fear isolates. It separates the suffering from the rest, as if dread were a sickness that could spread by contact. And in many ways it could. The emotional impact reached beyond the family and into the fabric of the community. People no longer greeted one another with warmth. They greeted one another with suspicion, eyes flicking to windows, to shadows, to the house that loomed at the center of it all. The sense of belonging dissolved, leaving only fragmented individuals, each haunted by the possibility that the neighbor they trusted might not be who they seemed. It is easy to measure the damage of violence in broken bodies or shattered doors. It is harder to measure the damage of fear, but in many ways it is worse. Fear consumes slowly, invisibly, hollowing people from the inside until nothing is left but vigilance and exhaustion. The family was proof of this. Their lives had not been taken, but they had been stolen nonetheless. Stripped of peace, stripped of safety, stripped of the illusion that they were ever truly secure. The worst part was not what had already happened. The worst part was what still lingered, what waited in the silence each night. Fear thrives on the unknown, and in that neighborhood the unknown had become endless. When fear begins to rot the foundations of daily life, people search for explanations. Answers, even incomplete, can offer comfort. But in this neighborhood, the search for truth led only to deeper uncertainty, because every theory seemed possible, and none could be proven. The first line of investigation came from the authorities. The family had called not once but several times, and eventually a patrol car was sent to circle the block during the late hours. For a few nights, the flashing lights reassured the residents, but reassurance is fragile. The disturbances did not stop. In fact, some claimed they grew worse after the visits, more deliberate, more mocking. A neighbor swore he saw someone standing in the shadows across from the police car, watching silently until the patrol left, as though confirming that no one truly intended to intervene. When officers were confronted with these accounts, they shook their heads. Without evidence of crime, their hands were tied. It was not enough to feel unsafe. Fear itself was not against the law. Some residents clung to the belief that there was a tangible human cause. Someone in the neighborhood, perhaps even a longtime resident, had slipped into obsession or malice. Theories spread quietly at back fences and whispered conversations. A retired man with no family who lived 2 streets over. A reclusive woman who never opened her blinds. Even the teenagers who lingered near the park after dark. Each theory named someone different, yet each carried the same implication. Danger lived among them. But suspicion, once released, does not stop at theory. It infects trust. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries began crossing the street to avoid one another. Accusations floated beneath every polite smile. Another line of thought reached further back into the history of the land itself. Some of the older residents, those who remembered before the houses were built, revived the whispers of strange activity in the woods. They recalled stories of lights drifting between the trees, of shapes moving in silence where no one should walk. A handful believed the disturbances were not human at all, but something tied to the ground, something that had been here long before concrete and glass reshaped the earth. They spoke of the original house, the one built before the neighborhood grew, and how every family who lived there left quickly, as if driven out by something unseen. Whether ghost, curse, or something nameless, this theory suggested that the darkness did not come from people, but from the soil itself. The family listened to these stories, desperate for clarity, but clarity remained elusive. Paranormal explanations offered a strange comfort. The idea that something supernatural was responsible excused the human face from suspicion. But comfort quickly gave way to deeper fear. If the source was not human, then it could not be reasoned with, caught, or stopped. It would linger, unbound, no matter what they did. Psychological theories emerged as well. A few residents insisted that fear itself had created the disturbances, that the family's anxiety spread like infection, leading others to interpret ordinary noises as sinister. They suggested that the notebook, the drawings, even the testimonies were shaped by suggestion, a cycle of paranoia feeding upon itself. Perhaps nothing unusual had truly happened. Perhaps they had all simply convinced themselves that it had. But such explanations carried their own cruelty, because to accuse someone of paranoia when they are living in terror is to leave them alone in their suffering. And the physical evidence, the footprints, the handprint on the window, the figure caught on the camera, refused to vanish under the weight of rational dismissal. Theories collided, none strong enough to silence the others. Some believed a neighbor was responsible, stalking quietly through the night. Others believed something ancient haunted the neighborhood, feeding on the fear it created. Still others clung to the notion of paranoia, unwilling to admit that danger might live so close. No theory explained everything. No theory gave the family peace. Investigations continued in unofficial ways. The father left the camera running for longer stretches, but the footage offered only fragments. A blurred movement, a sudden glitch, a shadow too vague to identify. A neighbor tried setting out traps convinced an intruder would leave physical proof, but the traps remained empty, untouched. Another family left their lights burning through the night, hoping to deter whoever or whatever stalked the dark. But the lights only seemed to invite more attention, as if proving how frightened they had become. Each attempt to solve the mystery only deepened it. Answers slipped away like mist, leaving only heavier questions. The community, once unified, split into factions. Those who believed in a human culprit, those who whispered about the supernatural, and those who denied it all. Each group grew more certain of its version, even as the disturbances continued. For the family at the center, the theories offered no relief. Instead, they multiplied their dread. If it was a neighbor, then every familiar face was suspect. If it was something supernatural, then they were powerless to resist. If it was paranoia, then their suffering had no enemy, no shape to fight, no way to end. Each possibility was worse than the last, because each meant they were trapped in a different kind of prison. The investigations left them more unsettled than before. No matter how many reports were filed, how many stories were collected, how many nights of footage were reviewed, nothing gave them control. They lived surrounded by possibilities, each one dark, each one unresolved. The truth of what haunted that neighborhood remained hidden, locked behind closed curtains, whispered in the silence of midnight. Theories filled the void, but none brought peace. And perhaps that was the cruelest revelation of all, the not knowing, the endless waiting, the certainty that something watched them without ever showing its face. The neighborhood no longer looked the same, though nothing on the surface had changed. The houses still lined the street in quiet symmetry, their shutters painted neat colors, their porches swept clean. Lawns were still trimmed, driveways still occupied by familiar cars, and children still walked to school in the early light of morning. But to those who lived there, the veneer of normalcy had cracked. Behind the fences, behind the glass of each window, suspicion and unease thrived. The true transformation was invisible yet undeniable. For the family at the center, the question had shifted. It was no longer about who or what was responsible. It was about whether they would ever feel safe again. Their home, once the place they returned to for comfort, had become a space heavy with dread. Each room carried echoes of footsteps, each corner carried the memory of a whisper. Even in silence, they felt it, the presence, the weight, the knowing. They were not alone, and they never truly had been. The father stopped writing in his notebook. The pages sat unfinished, the pen left on top as if abandoned mid-thought. Recording the evidence no longer mattered, because evidence had not saved them. The mother no longer drew the curtains in the morning. She left them closed as though daylight no longer promised safety. The daughter no longer asked questions about the figures outside her window. She stopped speaking of them at all, as if silence itself might erase their existence. But silence does not erase. It only buries, waiting until the weight is unbearable. Theories continued to circulate through the neighborhood, each family gripping their preferred explanation like a shield. Some swore a neighbor was guilty, though they had no proof. Some whispered that the land itself was cursed and moving away would not save them. Others clung to the comfort of denial, insisting nothing unusual had ever happened, that all of it was exaggeration. Yet even those who denied it found themselves looking twice at their windows before bed, locking doors more tightly, listening more carefully to the sounds of the night. The fear had become part of them, stitched into the rhythm of daily life, and perhaps that was the most haunting truth, that the events themselves mattered less than the shadow they cast. Because once fear takes root, it does not let go, Even if the disturbances stopped tomorrow, the family would still feel it. They would still wake in the night, convinced of footsteps outside their door. They would still flinch at the sound of gravel shifting, still tense at the whisper of curtains moving. Fear had rewritten them. What unsettled them most was not the presence itself, but the possibility that it had no end. There was no single night where everything could be explained, no final moment of confrontation that revealed the truth. Instead, there was only a continuing cycle of unease, of suspicion, of silence. They began to wonder if that was the point. Perhaps the true power of what haunted them was not in its actions, but in its ability to linger, to infect every thought, to make every ordinary moment feel like part of something sinister. The family considered leaving. The idea of escape grew more tempting with each passing week. But leaving carried no guarantee. What if the presence followed? What if the paranoia had already taken root so deeply that no new house, no new city, no new life could erase it? They spoke of moving in hushed tones, but always stopped short of planning. Fear held them in place, not only of what was outside, but of the uncertainty of what awaited beyond. And so they stayed with their curtains drawn, stayed with their lights burning late, stayed with their silence, their suspicions, their unanswered questions, stayed with the knowledge that something existed just out of sight. Whether it wore a human face, whether it belonged to the earth, or whether it lived only in their minds. The story of the neighborhood spread quietly beyond its borders. Visitors claimed they could feel the tension immediately, a weight in the air that pressed against them the moment they entered. Some left quickly, uneasy without knowing why. Others lingered, curious, though their curiosity rarely lasted long. The family never spoke openly, but word of mouth carried fragments of their story to those who wanted to hear. A story of whispers, of footsteps, of figures glimpsed and gone. A story of not knowing, and that is what lingers, the not knowing. Because the truth never revealed itself. There was no confession, no discovery, no resolution, only silence, only fear. Only the gnawing awareness that something or someone remained, unseen yet undeniable. It leaves us with a question that has no answer. Do you really know who lives beside you? Do you really understand the lives that unfold just beyond your fence, behind the curtains you cannot see through? Do you know what watches when you turn out the lights? What waits in the spaces you assume are empty? Perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is not what happened to one family or one neighborhood, but what it suggests about all of us. That the familiar can be dangerous, that the ordinary can hide the sinister, that the true horror is not in monsters from stories, but in the uncertainty of the people we pass every day. And so the story closes not with answers, but with silence. A silence heavy enough to keep you awake at night. A silence that makes you pause at your own window, peer into the dark and wonder if someone right now is staring back.